the screen sharing faculty turned on so folks can see some of the really helpful visuals that you've prepared for tonight. So,
thank you, Jim.
Oh, no, you're very welcome. No, it's quite all right. So, you know, I think you guys really summarized it very well, that all of us have a deep reservations about what's transpired in the election. But those of us who have been around for a long time have seen times like this before, where we've not gotten our menu of options satisfied in an election, but we know that it's not the end of all things. But tonight is, I think, strategic for everyone dialing in tonight. Psalm 11, verse 3 says, "When the foundations are being destroyed, what can the righteous do?" We're going to be talking about some very foundational things tonight with tonight's guests, and specifically as it relates to God's order in the institution of the family and directing the upbringing and the education of our children. And so tonight's guest, Michael Farris, is huge in that respect. Now, just a few comments about introducing Dr. Farris. He's the founder and the chairman of the Homeschool Legal Defense Association. Since founding HSLDA in 1983, Dr. Farris has used his extensive experience in both politics and appellate litigation to defend parental rights and help grow the organization to over 80,000 member families. Dr. Farris is also the founder and president of parentalrights.org. He devotes much of his time to meeting with members of Congress, delivering speeches across the nation, and in an effort to raise support for the passage of parental rights amendments in the Constitution. He's also the founding president and current chancellor of Patrick Henry College, a Christian institution with the mission of training students through a classical liberal arts curriculum and apprenticeship methodology to impact the world for Christ and for liberty. Dr. Farris has also written over a dozen books, including 3 novels, constitutional law textbooks, and works on marriage, parenting, homeschooling, political advocacy, and religious liberty. His daily radio program, Homeschool Heartbeat, airs on several hundred stations nationwide in recognition for his work in home education. Education Week has named Dr. Farris one of the top 100 faces in education of the 20th century. Heritage Foundation has also awarded him with the Salvatore Award for American Citizenship in 2002. Mike and Vicki Farris live in Purcellville, Virginia, and they have 10 children and 11 grandchildren. God bless them for that. So, Dr. Farris, thank you for making time in your busy life and busy schedule to be with us this evening.
I'm honored to be here, Jim.
So, you're the founder and the president of the National Parental Rights Organization, parentalrights.org. Why don't you give us a little bit of background about it? A lot of the folks here tonight are probably just hearing about the fine work you're doing. This is their first pass at that. Could you fill in the blanks a little bit of helping them understand how it came to exist and what its mission is?
Is my phone sounding okay?
I would say that it sounds a little choppy. Sounds a little choppy. I'm having a little bit of
Let me try something real quick. Give me a second.
Sure.
Oh, that's much better.
Does this sound better? No, not really. Well, parentalrights.org has a very narrow mission, but a very important mission. Our goal is to make sure that parents have the constitutional right to direct the upbringing and education of their children. Currently, that is debated because the Constitution has been interpreted to give parents rights, but it's an implied right. And because it's an implied right rather than an explicit right, the courts are really manipulating our rights in a very inappropriate fashion. And so our goal is to put the traditional test of parents into the black and white text of the Constitution in solid, understandable, knowable language so that our rights are permanent, are recognized, and that they will survive us, and that when my grandchildren are grown and have grandchildren of their own, it'll still be in place.
That's so important, I think, that in this day and age. And as I've come to understand your story and appreciate your work, I know that you kind of got drawn into this and engaged to this through some very significant life events of your own. Would you share with our listeners a little bit about the court case that you litigated in which the religious liberty of parents and family was infringed upon? It was a fairly dramatic experience you had through that, wasn't it?
It was. I assume we're talking about the case out in Washington State that I did when I was a young lawyer.
That's exactly right.
When the family there came to me, their son had been taken away on a temporary emergency order by the social workers in Washington State. And the reason that the social workers had taken the boy away was because he had gone to the school counselor and had complained that his parents took him to church too often. They went to church Sunday morning, Sunday night, and a Wednesday night prayer service. And the boy was apparently willing to go to church on Sunday morning, but nothing more. And the social workers were called in by the school counselor because they were so upset that this boy would go to church 3 times a week that they thought it was a violation of the child's rights. They believed it was not in the best interest of the child for him to go to church 3 times a week. And so they did an emergency removal. It was a Friday, and Sunday was coming, and he was going to have to go to church twice on Sunday. Now, emergency removals like this without a court order are supposed to be limited to things where the child's life, health, safety, something of that order, is in immediate peril, and there's not time to wait for a court order to stop the peril. And so twice going to church on Sunday is apparently, to these social workers, that kind of immediate peril. But the consequence of taking that boy away was that they had to give the family a fairly quick hearing. And my best recollection is that it was the following Tuesday that we had the hearing. It could have been Wednesday, but it was either Tuesday or Wednesday we had the hearing. And it was a half-day trial. We finished it up right after lunch, and the only issue in the case was how much church the boy should attend. And when we got all done with the testimony and so on, the judge said, I think that once a week is enough church for a 13-year-old boy. I'm guessing here about the judge, but just kind of look at him and sizing up his demeanor and his statements. Probably going to church once a week with his family would have been a bit of an uptick in the amount of church that was prevalent in their life. But he said, but I think that, that's enough, and if you want to retain custody of your son, you have to agree to take him to church only once a week. Now, if the judge wanted to make that decision for his own family, totally within his authority to do so. But for the court to say that this family could only take their son to church once a week, that was a usurpation of both parental rights and religious liberty in a pretty significant way. And I wanted to appeal the case. I was doing the case as a volunteer for the family, so it wasn't money that was the issue. But I could not promise the family that I could get custody back on a temporary basis while we went up to the appellate courts. And they just simply did not want to be deprived of the custody of their son for several months, maybe a year even, while the case was litigated through the appellate court system. And so they caved in. And so that case was one of the first that I was involved in. It wasn't the first, but it was one of the first, and certainly one of the most significant, that alerted me to the realization that we're going to have a real problem in this country with parental rights.
Yeah, we sure do, and it's a stunning illustration, a case study of something that, it's amazing. When I've heard about that story, and I've heard you relay that story before, that was some time back. Wasn't that in, like, the early 80s or something?
It was, yeah. And the interesting thing about it is, among other things, is that Washington State had enacted a law that codified the core provisions of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, Now, they subsequently have modified that law. There was so much kickback and pushback from many cases like this that arose in Washington State that the legislature eventually modified the law somewhat. And so, but we had an experiment. If we want to know what life is going to be like under the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, we just simply look at this period in Washington State. And so I was involved either in court, as I was in this case, or otherwise involved with families in two other situations. The other one went to the Supreme Court of Washington, where a 13-year-old girl had been smoking marijuana and had been sleeping with her boyfriend, and the family grounded her. And the courts found that this family's rules were reasonable and their method of enforcement was reasonable. But because they had conflict between the parent and child over these reasonable rules of discipline, they took custody away from the family to grant the wishes of the child. And that case went all the way to the Supreme Court of Washington State, which was, it was a horrible decision. In one more case, the family, the dad in the family was the pastor in charge of the Union Gospel Mission in my hometown, actually, in Kennewick, Washington, and served the needy there. And his family had decided that their daughter was not appropriate for their daughter to go to the junior prom. And the social workers called the dad and said, if you don't let your daughter go to the junior prom, we're going to take custody of her. So, one was church, one was a parenting decision about a dance, and another was very reasonable intervention by the parents on drug use and sex. And in every case, the social workers decided that they knew best how to raise children. And that's what we're going to if our country continues on the path that it is, especially if we adopt the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child.
Well, and as you bring that up, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, that's an interesting thing that's been evolving, and it's critical to tonight's content that folks understand what that's all about. Tell us about this international threat to parenting, to the rights of parents that's underway here on the international scene, and then try to distill that down to how that could be affecting us as Americans.
Well, I recently, about a year ago and a little bit, completed an extra law degree, an LLM in Public International Law from the University of London. And one of my professors from the University of London was the Amnesty International representative to the UN, who helped write the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. So to say that she's a child's rights advocate is the understatement of the century. And the most important thing for people to know about this UN treaty, like all UN treaties, is that it's a treaty which in our country creates binding rules of law that are part, according to the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution, is part of the highest law of the land. And so we have a duty to obey treaties. And the number one rule of international law is keep your promises. And if the United States enters into a treaty that promises to change our domestic law to comply with UN standards, that's exactly what we're supposed to do. If we're going to comply in good faith, we're supposed to change our law to comply with domestic standards. And anything that's in the treaty that conflicts with state law or a state constitution, the treaty automatically overrides it by the very words of the Supremacy Clause. So the starting point is a treaty is a law. It's a binding law. It's a higher law. And it does, in fact, this treaty does, in fact, conflict with state laws in our country, not just in little ways, but in significant core major ways. The biggest conflict is the best interest of the child standard, which if anybody's ever been around family court or juvenile court or anything in that nature, you will have heard the phrase, the best interest of the child standard. And what it means is that judges or other government officials, but in this context, judges, get to decide what they think, as a matter of personal opinion, is best for the child. Now, it's been around for a long time in our court system, but it's known as a dispositional standard. What that means is after the trial is over, after we've found that the family is guilty of abuse or neglect, after we found that the family is broken through the divorce process. So we've heard all the evidence, the judge has made a conclusion about the evidence, and they say there's something wrong with this family. It's broken because of divorce, it's broken because of abuse, it's broken because of neglect. After that, then and only then, a judge has the ability to decide what's best for the child. And that's the way our law has worked for 400 years, English American law. But what the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child does is it takes away the dispositional nature of this rule and says the government can decide what's in the best interest of the child always. Always. Just like was going on in Washington State. If you got a conflict between parent and child about drug use, the judge decides, the government decides what it thinks is best for your child on drug use. If you have a conflict over whether your child deserves to go to some extracurricular activity, the government decides what it thinks is best. No need to show harm, no need to show abuse, no need to show brokenness. The government simply steps in and it decides what's best right out of the gate. And it sounds so innocuous when you say, we're going to decide what's best for the child. Well, that sounds good. What's wrong with deciding what's best for the child? The answer is, what's wrong with this is that we take away the ability of the parents to make that subjective decision without ever requiring any proof of abuse or neglect. And that's just flatly wrong. It is a deep, direct, frontal attack on the family. And parents are no longer parents. They're simply babysitters, and the real parents are the government, and you have to call the real parents the government to get permission to do anything, just like a babysitter would have to do if a family had entrusted their child to the babysitter temporarily. The real authority would still reside with the parents. Well, folks, we'll all become babysitters if this treaty comes into effect, just like President Obama wants it to.
And it's interesting that you should say President Obama. I was going to ask you to comment a little bit because many folks of faith are very deflated by the outcome of the election, and the unfolding of these events really have a direct impact on this issue. Could you explain a little bit why this is in a new way elevated to a higher level of urgency for people of faith everywhere?
Well, this administration believes in the role and power of government. And it believes in it in such a way that it is willingly and aggressively attacking the two other institutions of our society that competes with government for loyalty, for attention, for decision-making authority. Those two institutions are the church and the family. And the church has been under attack in very direct fashion in the whole Obamacare area. And we need to understand that there's two levels of this attack. There's the direct attack on the issue of abortion services and birth control services, enforcing religious institutions like the Catholic Church, like Patrick Henry College, to pay for abortions, to pay for birth control services that otherwise we would say, no, that's a violation of what we believe. And so but that's the first attack. We should not believe that that's the only attack. There are going to be continuing attacks on the church. In the same fashion, this administration is pushing agenda items, mainly through the UN conventions, that will directly assault the family. And within 24 hours after winning the presidency a second time, the Obama administration has reopened UN talks on a small arms treaty that would directly control many aspects of Second Amendment rights in the whole arena of turning over our domestic authority to the United Nations. And we need to understand that there is an absolutely total commitment to the entire package of UN control. And if we want to debate the legitimacy of gun control, for example, okay, let's debate it. But I would hope that every American would agree with this proposition. Whatever our policy is on gun control, Americans should decide that alone. And nobody else in the world has any legitimate authority telling us what to do. The UN should not tell us what our policy should be on that issue. Well, as important as guns are, and I'm a big fan of the Second Amendment. I'm actually on an NRA committee on education. But the family is also critical to our freedom. The church is also critical to our freedom. And there are UN treaties that are going to be aimed directly at the family that are coming down the road really fast. The first one up out of the gate, and it's going to be happening in the next 3 weeks or so, is the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And it sounds nice, sounds good. They're lying about what it would accomplish. But what it would really accomplish, it has this best interest of the child standard. So every parent with a disabled child, by the way, disabilities are not defined in that, and then they say disability is an evolving concept. And so we don't know what it means. It could mean something as small as your child has glasses, your child has braces, your child stutters.
It opens interpretation.
Yeah, it is entirely open. But even, let's say it's recognized clear disabilities. Nonetheless, that doesn't mean that the child should be a ward of the state just because he has some disabling feature.
Exactly right.
The child should be the child of the parent. And one family that is well known of caring for and protecting a disabled child is Rick and Karen Santorum. And Rick and Karen have been on the warpath against this treaty ever since we alerted them to it. And with their daughter Bella, there's no better known story, no more touching story in this country about the need for parents being able to make decisions for their disabled child than the Bella story, Bella Santorum. And Rick and Karen understand that this treaty would say, no, we the government will decide what's best for Bella, not Rick and Karen. And folks, that's just not right. It's not right on several levels. The family's autonomy and the sovereignty of our nation both cry out against this assertion, and it goes on. I mean, there are dozens of provisions, dozens of problems in this treaty, but giving over the decision-making on policy to the UN and giving the government power over families, those are the two big ones, and those are so bad you don't even need to discuss problems 3 through 19.
Yeah, they absolutely are. And I think that you're very. That's a very discerning statement you talked about, where the real attack is on the two institutions God's installed as the God-given authority, the church and the family. Now, what are some of the rights given to children under this treaty? Because I think that folks need to understand. I mean, a lot of folks are hearing about this for the first time tonight. There are some pretty dangerous rights given to children, and maybe you can enlighten us a little bit on those.
Sure. There's the right to communication, and the right to communicate. It sounds like a good right, and in many respects it is.
Isn't that how it always is? Things are always veiled.
Yeah, and so
are veiled under the layer or the veneer of something noble sounding.
Right. So let's take an example. You have a 16-year-old daughter who decides to post a photo of herself on her Facebook page in a very skimpy bikini. And the parents, the dad especially, finds out about that and says, no daughter of mine's going to be portrayed like that on the internet. And, any dad with half a brain is going to intervene and say, you got to take that down. And if you don't take it down, there's going to be consequences. And so under the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, the father would have violated that daughter's right to communicate, because the only limitations that anybody can put on a child's ability to communicate are is basically enforcement of reasonable laws, laws that are reasonable in the minds of the UN, and there's specific standards. And I've truncated it just a little, but that's the essence of it, and it's accurate.
Sure.
So a dad would not be able to stop his daughter from putting a bikini picture on her Facebook page because it's not illegal to do so. It would only be if she crossed the line into actual porn would a dad be able to stop that, because child porn is illegal, and if she was actually doing pornography, he could stop her. But otherwise, he's violated her right to communication. That's one right. The ability of children to control their own religion is there, and if it's between the government and the child, no problem. I don't want the government telling my child what their religion would be, but this is between parents and children. And it depends on, every family's going to do this differently. And my youngest child now of the 10 is 15. And we're getting there. We're an age where I'd really want Peter to come along of his own free will, but nonetheless, probably at 15, I'm still going to say, Peter, let's say Peter decides he doesn't want to go to church on Sunday, and I would talk to him and say, Peter, what's the problem? We talk it through. And I'm probably at 15 going to say, Peter, I've heard you out, but you need to get in the car. We're going to church. And there's some stage of his life where I probably am not going to do that. But,
sure.
Disappointed I'm going to be. But right now, he's probably still just young enough where I would direct him on what he's going to do. And that's a parent's call on what stage and what age they would want to, make that call for their child. That's another right under this treaty, that by me telling my son to go to church and requiring him to do so, I would have violated the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. There's abortion rights in this treaty. There are birth control rights for children in this treaty. We would basically put Roe versus Wade and all the spins from Roe versus Wade into a more permanent documented text. Children would not be able to be spanked at all under this treaty. Even though the language does not explicitly say it, it's been interpreted officially so many times now that it's recognized that's the settled meaning of the article that prohibits cruel and unusual punishments. All spanking is defined as cruel and unusual punishment. And it goes on from there. It gets even worse.
Yeah, sure. I think folks are getting a good taste of what the implications of this would be if it were adopted and it became the superseding law over our existing laws. And I think it's important that folks know that this isn't without precedence elsewhere in the world. We can look to other nations that have ratified this treaty and learn how it affects families. Why don't you give us some examples of that, Dr. Farris?
Well, there are two basic approaches that other nations take relative to treaties. The United States is actually in a minority position where we take treaties seriously. There are many nations, including all Islamic nations, that ratify treaties, but they have no intention of really obeying them. Every Islamic nation in the world has ratified this treaty, but they've also ratified it with a proviso that says if this treaty violates Sharia law controls. And because their internal constitutions don't require treaties to be part of the highest law of the land, they're not. They're ignored. But the United States is in the handful of nations that takes it seriously. South Africa is another nation that takes its treaty obligations seriously. And there was a case that went to the South African Supreme Court involving a 12-year-old girl that had been living with her grandmother on a more or less permanent basis. And she had the grandmother murdered by two strangers. She drugged her grandmother, knocked her out, invited two strangers in, paid them by promising to have sex with one of them and telling them that they could steal any of the grandmother's property, and they ended up stealing her television and a few other odds and ends. And they murdered this woman. And under the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, the constitutional, or rather the Supreme Court of South Africa held that this girl could not be sentenced to juvenile detention at all, because under that treaty it says that children can only be incarcerated as a last resort. And so even though this crime was, it's hard to imagine a more despicable crime than what this 12-year-old girl did. They said you can't jail her at all because this is her first offense, and you're only supposed to do this as a last resort. And so what this treaty and its interpretation in South Africa tells us on a really broad scale is common sense is thrown out the window, because nobody would want to put a 12-year-old girl in jail forever for that. I mean, that wouldn't be right. But, the court said she had to go back and live with her mother. If I'm her mother, I'm not sure that I'm going to sleep at night. Because the girl never showed any remorse. She thought she was unrepentant entirely. And I think that, that everybody with any common sense to say, you know what, we need to keep her incarcerated just for a little while, at least for, 2-3 years or something. We need to incarcerate her for a while until we see some change in this girl. And so it's just not safe for people. But, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child was applied, and common sense went out the window. And that's what's going to happen under this treaty if the United States becomes a part of it.
Right. Now, it's my understanding that some courts are using the Convention of the Rights of the Child almost as a reference point already, as some kind of form analogous law to look to make decisions.
The United States Supreme Court has done so on 3 occasions, 2 involving juvenile justice cases, one recently out of Florida, where they've followed the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child.
This is not a state court. This is the federal Supreme Court.
Correct. And then other federal courts have held that the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child is officially binding. The Supreme Court used it as a helpful interpretive tool, but the other courts have held that it's binding on the United States, even though we haven't ratified it, under a doctrine known as customary international law, which means if enough nations in the world have adopted a treaty, it becomes a binding on everybody, even if there's not consent of the particular nation. And it's not because it's in a treaty per se, but because it's viewed as a rule of law that is nearly universally accepted. And that's a very dangerous doctrine. And so it eliminates the necessity for even ratification. So there is one federal judge in New York City that has done that twice, and it's been attempted in many other cases. Amnesty International and other groups attempted that in the Florida Supreme Court case I was talking about. I wrote the brief against them in the Supreme Court on behalf of the 16 members of Congress, and the Supreme Court, in its great wisdom, split the baby between the 2 positions. It was not mandatory, but they used it as an interpretive tool, which is, close enough to being mandatory that you can't hardly tell the difference. So we're already seeing this treaty shoved down our throats, and it's a theory of parenting that's just simply contrary to both common sense and history and tradition. And it's the government knows best. Rather than families are presumed to do the right thing with their child until there's proof to the contrary. Nobody with any sense says the parents always prevail, because there are parents that do really wicked things. But we presume the best about the parents, and we put the burden of proof on the government. And that's what the Parental Rights Amendment would do. Is we presume good things about parents, we put the burden of proof on the government, and when the government persuades the court under the very strong burden of proof, then and only then does the government get to intervene and override the parents. That's the correct, historically valid standard, and that's what we're losing in this country, and that's what we need to retain through the Parental Rights Amendment.
Jim, this is Adriana. I want to chime in here because we do have a number of questions. But before we do, I wanted to address a couple things, Michael, with you. One of them is, if people listening to you want to get involved and help with this effort, what would you say to them for them to do?
They should go to the parentalrights.org website, and sign up to get on that we have a petition there, and the petition really serves as its principal purpose is for them to give us their email addresses so that we can alert them when things are going on. And things are going on right now, but will be going on very rapidly in the next couple of weeks on another related UN treaty. This is the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, as we mentioned earlier in the program. And so they need to go to the website, sign up, and then there's other opportunities that will you could find on the website, and you can get involved at whatever level you have the time and ability to do. I mean, Adriana is our state coordinator for the state of Florida, and she is one of the best in the country. This is just a terrific advocate. And if you want to help out in a significant way, we've got ways for you to help. If you want to help out, once in a while, we've got ways for you to help. If you want to help out by just making calls and emails to your senator and your congressman, we want your help. And I'm absolutely convinced that if we have 10,000 people in 400 congressional districts in this country who sign our petition and by signing say, I will call my congressman and senator when it's time, that's 4 million people. 4 million parents who believe in the principle of parental rights can pass the Parental Rights Amendment. It's just a matter of getting 4 million people, and I can't get them all 4 million by myself. And so if we get some people like this radio show and this webinar who will sign up themselves and then go help us recruit a handful of their friends, we can get there. And so, 1,000 people who would recruit, the people on their Christmas card list, man, that'd be a big number, and we could go along with it. I mean, that's the equivalent of recruiting 10 congressmen right there. And so we need people who will stand up for what's right and will sign up and say, I will help, even if all you're promising to do is make a phone call once in a while. We need your help.
Okay, wonderful. So the website is www.parentalrights.org, and you can go there and sign up and receive the emails and get as involved as you can. I wanted to touch a little bit on the HHS mandate and Obamacare, and now after the elections, I think that many of us were hopeful that that the elections would resolve that issue for us, but they have not. And so now we are facing this situation and not knowing where to turn. Is the Supreme Court basically the only hope to overturn the HHS mandate, and is Obamacare just something now that cannot be overturned at all?
Well, there's still attacks left at the Supreme Court level, but they're going to be on discrete elements of it. The impact on the church and on Christian institutions like Patrick Henry College that don't want to pay for abortions, that'll probably get litigated before the Supreme Court as an independent question. And there may be other implementation details, but I don't think we can expect the court to reconsider its core decision about the overall constitutionality of this program. Congress, the House of Representatives, if they wanted to play hardball, could basically defund it by refusing to pass any budget that includes any funding for Obamacare. And if I was in the House of Representatives, that would be my position. I'm not funding this at all. I will refuse to fund it entirely. But I frankly don't expect the Republicans in Congress to play that kind of hardball. I think they're going to go along with it, at some level, and do it. So they're not easy answers here. We're going to have to fight that. The battle is going to be long haul, and the longer it takes to repeal Obamacare, the more difficult it's going to be to get socialized medicine out of our lives. And so I think it's incumbent upon us to stay alert and stay working on it, and I'm working right now on a kind of a comprehensive fix to all this stuff, because what we have to do is we have to get the federal government back to its constitutional boundaries, and make the states the locus of decision. And what we're going to have to do is we're going to take away the checkbook and the credit card from the federal government. They have proven themselves to be irresponsible, and the states need to step up and make that happen. Individuals will have a really hard time to do it. Attorney generals of the states need to step up and make it happen, and the legislatures. There are things state legislatures can do, a little bit beyond the scope of this program, but if people want to kind of pay attention to what I'm writing and talking about in this area, I'm going to lay out a lot of details about this in the next couple of weeks.
Okay, great. Okay. I want to get to some of the questions here. Many of the questions that have come in are relating to parental rights issues in divorce cases. And could you just clarify a little bit about, how the Parental Rights Amendment, where it falls in with those cases?
Every provision of the Constitution is subject to this basic rule. The Constitution controls the decisions of government. It doesn't control the decisions. So as a general matter, the Parental Rights Amendment would not have much to say about divorce cases, because divorce is a legal battle between two private parties, and neither of those private parties can violate the Constitution. Just like a church can't violate the Constitution, McDonald's Corporation can't violate the Constitution, and parents can't violate the Constitution. So divorce cases will continue to be decided under the domestic relations law. Now, if the domestic relations law did something crazy and took away fathers' rights in a broad way, the Parental Rights Amendment could come into play and correct that legislative problem. But it won't really have much to do with parsing out which parent should get, custody in a particular case, or which parent should make the educational decision in a particular case. That's going to have to be decided on using the domestic relations law of the state and not on federal constitutional standards.
Okay, yes, thank you for clarifying that. That helps a lot. We have a question here. We're getting some background fuzzy noise again. I don't know if that is if somebody on the call. Okay, well, we'll just deal with it. Okay, we have a question here from a homeschooler who says is a little concerned about, or quite concerned about the second term here of the administration, and what the effects of, well, potentially the UNCRC could affect, how it could affect homeschooling. And then the question: should we make a small private school? So should homeschoolers be concerned right now, and should they be forming small private schools?
Yes and no. Yes, they should be concerned. Everybody should be concerned. But if they come after us, they're going to come after us with a frontal assault. And it's going to be aimed at all private education that doesn't fit the mold of political correctness that the UN favors. And so, just like Germany's ban on home education, the reason they ban it is because they don't want people thinking differently than the government. And so there's an Emory University law professor in the United States that takes that German position for the United States. And she has called for the banning of all private education and the banning of homeschooling in this country, for the very reason that she thinks that we are dangerous when we teach our kids that Jesus is the only way to God. And so, I don't think those tactical things will be the issue. We just have to fight them head on, face to face, and if there are little tactical things that develop, we'll get to that. Right now, we're going to fight the big fight and defeat this treaty.
Okay. Yes, thank you. Here's another question. Are you familiar with the Canada's We Day? This concerns me greatly, as among other things, it teaches the child's rights of the UNCRC, and that the We Day has scheduled their first U.S. event in Seattle for March 2013. Is that something that you know?
The term's not familiar to me, but the concept is, I debated at Purdue University a few years ago. One of Canada's official enforcement attorneys, she's also a law professor, I believe in Nova Scotia. It was one of the maritime provinces in any event. And she said, among other things at the debate at Purdue, that the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child contained a philosophy of life that everyone should govern their lives by, which, make no mistake about it, that's what this is. This is a religion to them. They don't want people following traditional church doctrine in any way, shape, or form. They want them to follow the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child as the central organizing principle of their lives. And so this sounds like it has the homosexual rights agenda embedded in it and many other things, which is part of the whole UN strategy. But anything coming out of the UN and children is something that every American should be alert to and very afraid of. Not paranoid, but very afraid of, and want to fight back and want to stop it in this country. These are not small battles. These are huge conceptual battles that we need to undertake and make sure that we preserve our freedom.
Yes, okay, thank you. We have a couple questions about executive orders that President Obama has passed and how to, is there a way to basically protect the nation from those and just kind of overriding, constitutional process?
Well, if truth and justice were prevailing in the country, those executive orders would be declared unconstitutional, because the most important rule in the Constitution is found in Article 1, Section 1 of the Constitution. And it says, all legislative authority is vested in the Congress of the United States. That means all laws have to be made by Congress. Congress can't delegate that authority away, and the President cannot usurp it. But executive orders that deal with private people and private property are laws, and they are all unconstitutional. Now, if the President issues an executive order about the dress code in the White House, fine, he can do that. That's the internal operations of the government, and executive orders were intended for those kinds of things, the internal operations of the government. But when we use executive orders to make decisions that find private people and private property, we are denying the most fundamental thing about America, and that is Article 1, Section 1, all legislative authority is vested in the Congress of the United States. Every organization, the most important rule is who has the authority to make the rules. And when the President is usurping the authority to make the rules, it's called tyranny. And tyrants are exactly the opposite of what this nation was intended to foster. And whether it's the United Nations that wants to be a tyrant over our Americans, if it's the Supreme Court, if it's the President, if it's the Environmental Protection Agency, anyone other than Congress or our state legislatures or our city councils that tries to pass laws that we have to obey, they're being tyrants, and we need to fight back. The Supreme Court is not doing the right thing in this area, and we're going to have to get the states to step up and put a stop to this. It's kind of along the line of the other thing we talked about earlier. The states have some constitutional power they haven't used, and we're going to have to see to it that they get to using that. And it's way too complicated to explain here in a short while, but hang tough. We're going to make that explanation in the next couple of weeks.
Okay. Okay. There's a few more questions here. Can the states? So you brought up the states here. Somebody's asking a question if the states can actually do something to protect parental rights.
There are two powers that states have that they can do, and we are going to this year we're going to start a project to have states pass state statutes to put parental rights into the actual text of their state law. I helped to write a law for Michigan in 1994, right after a bad Michigan Supreme Court decision on parental rights in the context of homeschooling, and that passed. And this last year, I had the privilege of litigating a medical parental rights case in Michigan, and I got to use my very law that I helped write, almost 20 years ago. And so it's a good thing to have state statutes. Now, we have to keep in mind that state statutes can be overridden by treaties, and so it's not a permanent fix because of the possibility of treaties. And that's why we need the Parental Rights Amendment. But it is something that the states can do on the short run that would be really good to have on the books for the next 5 to 7 years while we're working to pass the Parental Rights Amendment.
Okay. Yes. Okay. Very good. One person asked, why have so many Christian nations signed on to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child?
Well, the answer is because most nations don't pay any attention to their treaty obligations. And under their domestic law, the technical term is they're dualist nations, not monist nations. I just got this law degree in international law, so I want to show off that I learned something and actually deserve to pass the exams. A monist nation is like the United States, which means that we just have one law. And the international law is integrated into our law through the supremacy clause, and treaties are part of the highest law of the land. Dualist nations like Great Britain and almost all of Europe take the position that international law is not directly a part of the law of the land, and only when the legislature says that it is it. And so they ratify treaties as feel-good provisions, and they're just what I call yada documents. You ought to do this, you ought to do that, you ought to do the other thing. And they don't have any meaning. And, if the United States wanted to pass a yada document, then fine, pass a yada document. We could say, we like kids, hip hip hooray for kids, and that's it. Well, like National Pickle Week or something, that's a yada document. Yada, I'll go out and buy some pickles this week. Well, treaties are not that in the United States. They are in so many other countries, but not in the United States. They're very serious documents, and so that's the short answer. The other answer is, even though they may be, there's some nations that are have Christian heritage, because they've adopted so much socialistic tendencies, they really have come to believe that the state is the central institution for life, not the church, not the family. And the United States is pretty much standing alone against the rest of the world on that subject right now, and we're teetering on the edge of that. There's a lot of church-going people that just voted for a very socialistic president, and we need to understand that if you think the purpose of government is to provide for our needs, that's socialism. If you think the purpose of government is to provide protections for life, liberty, and property, and to punish those who do evil, that's freedom. And we need to have a free country, not a socialistic country, because when there's a battle between the state and the family, and the state and the church, in a socialistic state, family and the church lose. The state wins. And that's another indicator when you're living in a socialistic state.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to take on 2 more questions, and one of them just relates to she actually specifically says about Glenn Beck and trying to get him to discuss this, but basically media at large. I mean, there have been media outlets that have really broadcast this issue?
I've been on the Mike Huckabee show twice about this issue, and it's been a little while now, but that was very helpful. We got a lot of people to sign up as a result of being on the Mike Huckabee show. And I've been on a lot of radio programs, some bigger, some smaller. But Glenn Beck, I don't know what the deal is with Glenn Beck, but we have done everything we know what to do, try to get on his show, and he just won't give us the time of day. And I don't know what to do. If somebody knows Glenn Beck, they need to ask him to have us on the program. But and if people know other media outlets, if if they're fans, I've been on the Bill Bennett show about this a couple times, a few other things, but the biggest thing is Huckabee by a long shot.
Okay, yes, and I mean this is clearly an issue that we ourselves can broadcast too by writing to newspapers and just being outspoken about it. And then the last question, because it's 10 o'clock already, a couple minutes after, one person asked, what about parental rights regarding education? And I think this is an excellent question because actually one of the non-negotiables that Pope Benedict mentioned was the right of parents to educate their children, and specifically church documents have singled out religious education and also sexual education, and I know that is something that is really being infringed upon today. Could you just address that a little bit?
Sure. I just spoke about this last Saturday in Germany, where I talked about the right of parents to direct the education of their children as a basic human right. We'll all remember that the Nazi Germany took control of the children of that nation and overrode both the church and the state on education decisions and philosophical decisions. And as a result of that, the human rights movement response through the 1960s was to declare the right of parents to the education and training of their children, particularly moral religious education, to be at the highest level of parental rights in the UN Convention called the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. There are 7 rights that are listed as non-derogable rights. And what non-derogable means is you can't derogate, you can't take away that right, even when there's an emergency that threatens the existence of the government. And the 7 rights include: you can't torture people, you can't put people in as slaves, you can't commit genocide, you can't. There's 7 of them, and the 7th is religious freedom, including the right of parents to direct the religious and moral education of their children. The modern UN treaties leave that out. Parental rights for education are not repeated in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. They're not repeated in the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So we see a big shift in that area. We've gone away from the traditional standards, even in human rights law. Human rights law started off with good ideas on this particular point, bad ideas in some other areas, but on this point, the first wave of human rights law in response to Nazi Germany were great. Unfortunately, what's happening is we're moving back toward Nazi Germany rather than away from it, and the only difference is that are cosmetic differences on this subject between the current regime, the current internationalist regime, current countries like Germany and Sweden on educational decisions, and the Nazis. It's far more alike than they are dissimilar, and we need to see what's coming. When I was in Germany a week ago, people were coming up to me and say, "Thank you for standing up for the family, both in Germany and the United States, and you guys need to do whatever you can to keep the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child out of your country, because it will be devastating to your parental rights in education."
Wow. So we have a lot of work to do. I do want one question just came in right now that I find very interesting, and I just want to point it out. It says, will medical long-term care be denied to a Down syndrome baby under the new health care mandate? Do you see a threat to that kind of health care?
Well, I don't know the specific answer to that today, because there are thousands of instances in the health care bill where it says the Secretary shall make rules to do X, the Secretary shall make rules to do Y. And the mandate on the church to furnish birth control and abortion services is not found in the actual text of Obamacare, but the Secretary has made rules to interpret the legislation and to implement it, and that's where that came from. Well, I can see the Secretary making rules on severely handicapped, severely disabled children, saying that they should be taken out of existence. They should be killed because they like to listen to Pete Singer at Princeton University. People like that. That's political correctness, and so there will be a regime of political correctness in a very aggressive, very deadly form that raises itself up out of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child if our nation is so foolish as to ratify it.
Wow. Okay. Well, it's already almost 10 after, so we do want to close. We want to thank you so much, Dr. Farris, for joining us and for giving us so much information. And, honestly, it's heavy. It's heavy stuff. It's a lot of threatening things on religious liberty, including health care and on parental rights. But what that just reminds me again is that we have work to do, specifically in the area of parental rights. There is involvement that we can take to secure those parental rights, to fight for the Parental Rights Amendment, and to help keep at bay those treaties that would be so devastating to our nation. And then also to turn inward to the church. I believe that we are called to just return, to cry out to the Lord and to return to Him fervently and with passion. And it is through His strength and through faith in Him that we are victorious. So we have.
Well, I fully agree with that. And in the book of Isaiah, it says that though our nation's sins are scarlet, although the passage clearly applies to salvation, it's actually written to national sin. Though our sins are scarlet, they can be as white as snow. Though they're as red as crimson, they can be like wool, which tells us that turnarounds are what God's about. And we need to be people of faith and persist. And in the parable of the persistent widow in the book of Luke, Jesus says that we should persist in demanding justice in the face of injustice. And then he asks the question, when I return, will I find faith on the earth? And that means when we see injustice, to show the kind of faith that Jesus wants us to have until he returns, is we are there demanding justice in the face of persistent injustice. And that's our calling. I believe that God will bless that and give us victories far beyond our numbers deserve if we simply are faithful.
Amen. Those are wonderful, uplifting words to close with, Dr. Farris. Thank you so much. And we're going to close. Dr. Manny Gonzalez, and co-founder of Catholics Call to Witness, is going to close us in prayer. I want to thank Jim also for helping us out with the conversation with Dr. Farris, and to everyone who attended. We pray for you, and we just want to thank you again. Good night. Here we'll close in prayer.
In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. This is from from Psalm 3. It says, "O Lord, how many are my foes? How many rise up against me? How many are saying of me, God will not deliver him? But you are a shield around me, O Lord. You bestow glory on me and lift up my head. To the Lord I cried aloud, and he answers me from his holy hill. I lie down and sleep. I wake again because the Lord sustains me. I will not fear the tens of thousands drawn up against me on every side. Arise, O Lord, deliver me, O my God." Thank you, Lord. Thank you for your promises. And I ask you, Lord, for everyone listening to us tonight, fill, Lord, everyone with your Holy Spirit. Give us the strength, Lord, to stand up for you. And I'll remind everybody of our Lord's words when he was confronted with crisis. This is from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 5. He says, "Do not be afraid, just believe." Thank you, Lord. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Amen. Good night, everybody. Thank you for your attention.